All right, then we can go ahead and get started. So, hello, Jeffrey. Thank you for joining us.
Hi there.
So we're gonna, I'm a dietetic intern with the Open Door, which just means that I am studying to be a registered dietitian. And in order to do that, I have to do an internship. And so this is part of that. And to meet some of the requirements, I have to do some nutrition education. So my little PowerPoint is going to be pretty short, but it just has some nutritional information about fermented foods. So we can dive in. And there we go. Okay, so what are fermented foods? And some of you may know this. Fermented foods are just foods that have been preserved by a process that turns the carbohydrates in the food into alcohols and or acids using bacteria, yeast, sometimes fungi. And I'm just going to call these throughout the presentation the good bugs. So fermentation uses the good bugs to preserve our food, and they can also give us some nutritional benefits, which we'll get into in a little bit. Some traditional fermented foods are injera from Ethiopia. It's a fermented sorghum, kind of tastes like sourdough bread, and they use it as a utensil to pick up food when they're eating. Dosa is from India, and it's made from rice and Bengal gram, which is a variety of chickpea or garbanzo bean. And kimchi is from Korea, and that's made with fermented cabbage and a sauce that they ferment the cabbage in. Sauerkraut is, again, fermented cabbage from Germany. And miso is fermented rice and soybeans, and that originates from Japan. And tempeh originates from Indonesia, and those are fermented soybeans. So you can see on the side, I have a few examples of these fermented foods. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because fermented foods have been around for a really long time, and they are a tradition in a lot of cultures to eat these fermented foods. And some cultures can even eat up to like 80% of their foods from fermented foods. So they really play a big role in a lot of people's lives. And we're now learning that they can provide some nutritional benefits for us as well. So why do people make fermented foods? Back in the day, before refrigeration, fermentation was a way to preserve fresh vegetables. And other things such as meat or dairy products. And it's been used to ferment or to preserve a lot of different foods. In the examples I had, rice was an example in the dosa. And so it can be used to ferment grain or preserve grains, and all types of foods basically can pretty much be fermented. The flavor is definitely changed when foods are fermented. And that has become a desirable flavor for a lot of people. So that is another reason why we ferment foods. And it's just not really a flavor you can get through cooking or, other food processing methods. And now we're learning more about how fermentation can release certain nutrients into foods. So the good bugs can break down undigestible compounds in foods to make them more digestible for us. And they can also take away some compounds maybe that we don't want, such as sugar. The fermentation process will break down sugars and can lower the glycemic index or lower how much a food may spike your blood sugar when you eat it. And there's a lot of research going on in this area, and there's definitely more research that needs to be done. But what they're finding right now is that fermented foods do have health benefits. So some of the health benefits from fermented foods include gut health, which includes our intestines, and in connection with that, mental health. So Fermented foods and fiber, when we eat them, they can give us the good bugs in our large intestine. And in the large intestine is where a lot of our immune system, or the system that protects us from the outside world, basically lives in. And when we have these good bugs, it can support our immune system and help prevent illness or help heal us. And our guts are also connected to our brains, and that's called the gut-brain axis. And so there's been research on how people that are suffering from mental illness, or maybe not a severe mental illness, it could be something that's more minor, like a minor depression or minor anxiety, but it does look like people that are dealing with mental illness tend to have a different type of bug, or the bad bugs in our guts, compared to healthy individuals who tend to have more of the good bugs. So eating fermented foods and fiber can give us these good bugs and then promote gut and mental health. So some of the fermented foods we're going to make today are sauerkraut, and that was on my example. That originates from Germany. And we're going to make some fermented veggies. And this recipe can really be customized to whatever you want to use and whatever you have on hand. And then we're also going to make vinegar. So our first recipe, we are going to start with sauerkraut. And sorry, one second here. So we're going to start with sauerkraut. And some things that you'll need are a jar with a lid. So I like to use these quart-sized jars. So these quart-sized jars are 4 cups and about, a little under 800 milliliter jars. Or sorry, a little under 900 milliliter jars. So it's about a liter. And then you also need a large bowl, a large knife, something kind of like this. You can use a smaller knife, but I found it easier to use a large knife just because the cabbage head is pretty large. A head of cabbage. I used a purple cabbage, which I cut up here, and then some salt, any spices, herbs, or other veggies that you want to add to your sauerkraut. So I am going to stop sharing for a minute, and then I'm going to switch on my other camera so you guys can see what I'm doing here. Okay, and then we will pin that guy and my pins. Okay, so all right, so for the sauerkraut, I used some purple cabbage. Can you see here? Yeah. So I used purple cabbage, and this is a whole cabbage head. And for 1 cabbage head, you want to use about 2 tablespoons of salt. You can use more, but then it gets a little salty. The only thing is you don't want to use less salt. Less salt is where we can get into possibly promoting those bad bugs growing. So we want to make sure we're using enough salt to ferment our food. And I've had this sitting for a little bit with some salt on it already. But basically, we're going to massage that salt into the, oops, sorry, I have a cat. Let me get him down for a second. Milo, get down. Sorry about that. So we're just going to kind of massage the salt into our cabbage, and it's going to start wilting. It's definitely not going to be as firm as it was when you first cut it. And you're going to see that some liquid is starting to come out of the cabbage. And the reason that happens is because the salt can pull water out of veggies. So that is part of the process for making the sauerkraut. And so we're just going to kind of mix this around a little bit. You have to do it for a little while, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, in order to get the cabbage to be kind of broken down and pretty wilted. You don't want it to really hold its shape well if you were to pick it up. It should be wilting significantly. And I have a lot of cabbage here too, so this takes a little bit longer than if you were to do a really small head of cabbage, or if you were just to do half a head of cabbage. But I used an average size head of cabbage. My cabbage was about 4 pounds. So 4 to 5 pounds is usually about the weight of your average cabbage. And like I said, you want to make sure you're using enough salt. So if you were to get a really large head of cabbage, you might want to add another tablespoon or half tablespoon of salt to your sauerkraut. Now, one thing we can also do, instead of just having our cabbage here, is we can add other things. We can add spices or other vegetables. So one thing I have here is I have some chives, and I am just going to cut up a few chives here, and I'm going to add those to my sauerkraut and start massaging those in as well. And I'm just going to roughly chop them. And these will kind of provide a little bit of that oniony flavor that chives offer. But flavors do change throughout the fermentation process, so it's not going to taste exactly like chives normally do. So I have some chives. I also have some mustard seed here. And so when you're using any spices, for sauerkraut, you can use some ground spices because, you know, you're kind of mixing it in. But oftentimes in fermentations, you want to use whole spices just because ground spices can get, they can kind of float to the top and can cause mold in your fermentation, which is something we don't want. So I just put some mustard seed here and some chives, and I'm just going to continue massaging that around for a few more minutes until this really starts to get kind of soft. Some other things you could put in your sauerkraut would maybe be like shredded carrots. I also have heard, I watched a video one time where someone mashed up blueberries with their cabbage, and they said it tasted really good. That's not something that I've done, but it would definitely add a different dimension of flavor to your sauerkraut. All right. And so I'm gonna massage this a little bit more, and then I'm just gonna let it sit for a little bit to let that salt really kind of do its work and pull out as much water as we can get out of the cabbage. And then we'll move on to the next fermentation recipe, and we can come back to the sauerkraut. All right, so I'm going to set this aside. All right, so that process that we are doing with the sauerkraut is called a dry brine. And what that means is that we're not adding any liquid to the fermentation process. The liquid is coming entirely from the vegetables. And let me unpin this now. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen again. So like I said, the sauerkraut, that's called a dry brine because we're just adding salt and we're using the liquid from the vegetables themselves. The next recipe, just fermented vegetables, this is going to be what they call a wet brine process. And that's because we are going to add water to the jars that we use. So for a wet brine fermented vegetable, you are going to need a jar with a lid, similar to the one I showed you before, a knife. This one doesn't have to be big just because a lot of the vegetables we're going to use are probably going to be a little bit smaller than your typical head of cabbage. You may also want a plastic bag like this with some water in it, and I'll get to how we're going to use that a little bit later. For these fermented vegetables, you really want to use hard veggies, and that means we want to use like carrots, radishes, cauliflower, broccoli, green beans, cucumbers, things like that that have a little bit of crunch to them. Other vegetables, or I guess technically tomatoes are fruit, but tomatoes are really soft and things tend to soften in the fermentation process. So adding something soft is going to just kind of make it gooey, which is not usually the desired texture that we want when we're making fermented vegetables. However, you can use them if you like that texture. Also things like leafy greens and like spinach or lettuce, ones that are really easy to tear and are very soft, not like cabbage, but softer leafy greens, those usually don't hold up well to the fermentation process either. So we want to kind of stay away from those when we're doing fermentations. Again, whole spices are great. Fresh herbs are great for this recipe, and then you'll also need salt. So I am going to switch my screen again, and we will do this recipe.
Hey, Jess, can you pin the video that's on your phone for this?
Yes, did I not do that? Right? Can you see it now? Is that pinning the video on my phone?
No.
No? Oh, okay. I thought I added the pin to it. But I guess maybe it just pins on mine. Oh, well, that's unfortunate.
Well, we can still see, so it's okay.
Okay, you can still kind of see what I'm doing. I can turn my camera down a little bit too, so you can maybe have a better view of what I'm doing. Or, you know what I can do is I can just turn my microphone off on my computer and turn it on my phone.
Recording in progress.
Oops, let me turn. Give me 1 second. I need to turn it off. Sorry, I'm trying to find the meeting. Logged off on my phone for some reason. Let me log back. But it says I'm still on here. I don't know why it's. Okay.
Recording in
Now it should work. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. The video is, let me turn that off. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm just gonna pin you on my personal computer.
Okay. Well, does it record from my computer or?
It looks like it's recording from your computer and not from the phone.
Right, but if I pin my phone video, will it record? I think it records the screen that's pinned.
Okay, that'll be
But
good.
so let me try that again and we'll do this. Okay. But you can see my video, my phone screen now, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So sorry about that technical difficulty. So we are going to do the fermented vegetables again. So you'll want a jar. I use quart-sized jars usually. And for every quart of your fermented vegetables, you'll want to use 2 tablespoons of salt. And so what I'm going to ferment today, just going to move that over for you guys, is I cut up some cucumbers. And so I'm going to make some fermented pickles. So fermented pickles are different from your traditional pickle because fermented pickles have been, well, fermented, and your regular pickling process uses vinegar. And vinegar is a fermented product, and we'll be making that today. But just putting cucumbers in vinegar does not ferment the cucumbers themselves. It will preserve the cucumbers and make pickles, but it is a different process. Oh, so usually what I like to do before I get ahead of myself is I'll put when I'm doing a wet brine, I'll put any spices or herbs in the bottom of the jar. And the reason I do that is because the other vegetables help hold it down. And that'll be important once we get to the end of this recipe, and I'll explain again, and I'll explain why. So I have some fresh thyme that I'm just gonna put in here that I picked from my garden. And then I also have some dill as well that I got from my garden. So I'm just gonna stick that in there. I have some ginger that I sliced up. So I'm gonna put a few ginger slices in here as well. And then I have some coriander seeds. This bottle says cinnamon, but they are coriander seeds. So I'm gonna put some of these in here as well. And then I'll also put some mustard seeds. I have some cumin seeds that I'm gonna put in here too. And all these whole spices do is really just add flavor to your vegetables. And if you like the fermented vegetable flavor on its own, that is just fine. You don't have to add these spices. But I like to add them to just add a little bit of flavor layers to my fermented veggies. I also have a Thai chili here that I'm gonna chop up and put into my fermentation. Put that in there and be sure not to touch my face after that. I have another one. I'm just going to chop this guy up too. Put that in there. So, like I said, I like to put the small things at the bottom because my cucumbers will help hold them down in the fermentation process. So I'm just going to fill my jar with these cucumbers that I cut up. You don't have to be gentle. You can kind of push these down a little bit. Because we're going to want to make sure that they are below the saltwater mixture that we make. And that's part of the importance of using whole spices in a wet brine like this, is because if you use powdered spices, those powders can float up to the top and can cause mold. And that's also why I like to put my spices and the smaller items on the bottom of my fermentation, because like I said, these cucumbers are going to hold them down and prevent them from floating to the top and causing mold. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to fill this jar with water. All right, so I'm going to fill that with water. And then I'm going to scoop out anything that's like floating on the top right now. Actually, you don't have to do that right now because we're going to mix this up. And then you'll want to do it afterwards, after we mix it. So like I said, for a 1 quart jar, you want to use 2 tablespoons of salt. You could potentially use a little bit less salt, but like I said, I like to be on the safe side and use a little more salt than necessary. And then you can always, especially with wet brine, fermented vegetables, you can always wash them off before you eat them. Or you can soak them in new water, and that will help draw some of the salt out of the vegetables so you're not eating as much salt if you don't like that extra salty taste. And then I'm gonna be right back. I forgot to grab a lid, so I'm gonna do that. All right, so I have my lid and I put my salt and my vegetables are in there. And now I'm just gonna kind of tip it back and forth. And you want to dissolve all the salt. So you don't want to see a bunch of salt. Usually it collects at the bottom. So you don't want to be seeing a bunch of salt collecting at the bottom. Just kind of shake it up pretty good. It'll start to look a little cloudy. And if there is some salt at the bottom, that's okay. It will eventually dissolve in the water that we have here. Okay. So now that that's all shaken up, what we're gonna do is, and I don't know if you guys can see this here, I'll try and show you. There's quite a few things floating at the top of my ferment. And I wanna scoop those out, because if I don't scoop those out, those are the things that are gonna cause mold, okay? So I'm gonna scoop as much of those out as I can. And if you were to put your whole spices in after your vegetables, basically all of your spices would be floating. And then there's none really left in your ferment to give it flavor. So that's why I recommend putting it in. That's why I recommend putting it in at the beginning. So this might overflow a little bit here, and that's okay. Let me put this in a bowl so I don't spill everywhere. So then this is where the bag comes in. So we want to make sure that our vegetables stay below the top of the water, this water salt mixture. And to do that, we need to weigh things down. Now these cucumbers are in here pretty tight, but when things ferment, their shape changes a little bit and they might get smaller. And so that could cause some of these to float up to the top. Oh. Sorry about that. Just gotta plug my phone in real quick. Okay. So we want to make sure that we're keeping everything under the saltwater mixture. And so that's what this bag is for. You can use it as a weight. Otherwise, there are some more fancier things that you can get out there, like these fermentation weights that fit into jars. I have a few of these. They're not extremely expensive, but they are an expense. So if you don't want to, if you're just trying out fermentation, you don't know if you like it, I would recommend going with the Ziploc bag, just because they're cheap and they're easy to dispose of if you don't like fermentation. So yeah, this overflowed a little bit, but what you want to do is just have this bag resting on top here. And this should hold everything underneath the water. If there is anything that you see that floats outside of the bag, you can just pull that out. But basically, we want to make sure that everything is underneath the water. And then what I like to do, if I have room, which I may not for this, is I'll just put the lid over the top. If you don't have room to put a lid over the top of whatever you're using to weigh it down, you can use something like a coffee filter, just to keep any like dust or anything out of your fermentation, because we don't really want to be eating dust. And in order to, you know, keep that out, you can just rubber band it onto your fermentation. And then what you're going to do is you are going to leave this sit out for 4 to 7 days. And by sit out, I mean just in your kitchen, on the counter. You want to make sure it's relatively untouched, just because you don't want to be shaking up anything else to make it float. But you do want to check it every day to make sure you don't have anything floating that can cause mold. But you don't need to stir it or anything. You can just take the lid off, check it. If there's anything there, scoop it out. If not, you can just leave it be, and that's fine. 4 to 7 days is usually when it starts tasting really good and smelling really good. And that's when you can stop your fermentation, or if you want to make those flavors stronger, you can let it go a little bit longer. I wouldn't recommend probably letting it go more than like 10 days, because flavors can get really, really strong. And you raise your chance of getting mold in your fermentation. But I usually do 7 days, and I'll put it on top of my counter and just check it every day. And then once you want to stop your fermentation between the 4 and 7 days, you can just cap it. You can remove the weight, put your lid on, and then you can put it in the fridge, and the fridge will stop the fermentation, or really significantly slow the fermentation process. And you can keep things that are fermented in the fridge for months. I forgot to grab one thing out, so I'm going to show you. I have this fermentation that I did back probably in March. And this is still looking really good. There's no mold in it. It was cabbage, and I put some oranges in it and some Thai chilies. And then I also put some cinnamon and star anise in it. And I probably shouldn't have done that because I'm not a huge fan of licorice. So that's why it's been sitting in my fridge for so long, is I haven't figured out what to do with it yet. But this looks just fine. There's no mold. So there's nothing that looks weird. It smells the same as when I ended the fermentation. So you can really keep things for a really long time in the fridge that have been fermented. So that's just an example of how long you can keep fermented foods. So I'm going to set this aside, and then we can move on to the next recipe. So the next recipe we are going to do is, let me just switch my things here. And then we'll turn this on. Okay. I am going to talk through my phone. And then I will just pin my video to hopefully record that. Okay, and then I will share my screen one last time. Okay, so now we're moving on to vinegar. Vinegar is a fermented product like the vegetables. However, we don't usually eat what we use to make the vinegar. And by that, I mean, we typically make vinegar with fruit. When you're making your own vinegars, you can make it with fruit. So many people have heard probably of apple cider vinegar. That's made from apples. And today I have some raisins that I'm going to use and some apricots, some chopped apricots. And so I recommend when you're making vinegars, try to use dried fruit if you can. From what I found, dried fruit tends to reduce your chances of mold when making vinegar. But the things you'll need to make your vinegar are a jar. I'm going to use a pint jar for my vinegar instead of the 1 quart jar. You'll need some coffee filters like I covered the other jar with. So a coffee filter, or you could use a towel, that works too. Same thing for the other fermentation. If you don't have coffee filters, you can cover it with a towel instead. And then your choice of dried fruit. So that's everything you need for this recipe. Oh, and water. But once you get this going, you'll want to ferment it for about 20 days. And then you're going to strain off the dried fruit and then ferment it for another 10 days. And then once that's done, you can just put a cap on it and you have your vinegar there for however long. And it's going to age over time and the flavors will get stronger and more pronounced. And it makes for really good vinegars. So I'm going to switch my video over and we can go through that process with you. All right. Okay, so to make the vinegars, like I said, you want dried fruit. And for a pint, 1 pint jar, you probably want maybe about a 1/4 cup to a 1/3 cup of fruit, of dried fruit. And you can put this, in here. If you do use fresh fruit, you'll have to make sure that you definitely stir it every day. Maybe even more than once a day, and you check on it regularly. And you also want to make sure that you are chopping your fruit up pretty finely. So for my apricots here, a whole dried apricot is maybe like this big, but I chopped it up into a few pieces, and that just helps the fermentation process. If you leave something whole, it's a lot harder for those good bugs to get in there and do their work. So now I have my raisins here, and I'm just gonna pour water over them and fill this jar with water. So I have some more water over here. And I'll probably just give it a little stir. Before I cover it with my coffee filter. And again, so you can use a coffee filter or a towel to do this part. I must have lost my rubber band. But basically you just rubber band over it like I showed you in the last one. And then you can just set it off to the side on the counter for 20 days, like I said. You want to make sure you are taking, sorry, let me bring this back. You want to make sure that you're taking off the coffee filter and stirring it at least once a day and looking for any mold or anything that develops. If you do get a little spot of mold on there, you can just scoop it out and continue on fermenting. And then after 20 days, you want to strain out your fruit and keep the liquid. And then you'll just ferment the liquid without the fruit for another 10 days. And then after about a total of 30 days, so 20 days fermenting with the fruit, 10 days fermenting without the fruit, that's when your vinegar will be done. And that's when you can put a lid on your vinegar and keep it in your cabinet to use for a variety of things. Vinegars are extremely versatile, and you can use vinegars to make sauces. You can use it to make salad dressings. You could use it in a drink. You could do a variety of things with vinegars. They're extremely useful, and it's really fun to kind of have your own vinegars around with unique flavors that you can't get in the store. So, I don't know if anyone's ever tried, but I've never been able to find raisin vinegar around, but now I'll have some raisin vinegar. All right, so that is all I have for you for the fermentation class. If you have any questions, you can feel free to email me or Elpa, and I can put my email or Elpa's email. We can put that in the email that we send out with this video. or we can put it in the comment section on YouTube. So, all right. Well, I hope you all have a fun time fermenting, and thank you for joining me today. Great.
Thank you.